Hello. We are starting a few minutes early, so no one is probably going to be here yet. I am Rosebud Reads, and welcome to my book garden. Actually, welcome to my basement. But we're gonna have a good time anyway. So if you somehow are tuning in now, this is actually an ongoing reading of the book Little Mushroom. We reached the very beginning of part 2 of book 1, so Roses, which will be continuing on this stream. I'm just going to give it a little time for anyone to come in. I accidentally started the live stream a little bit early. So we're just gonna wait just for a little bit. So yes, it being a basement, it is definitely a little bit chilly, so please don't mind me. Hopefully all of you who eventually watch this. Oh, hi! Momar's Rover. It doesn't register you as here. I would have said hello before. Hello! Welcome! I'm excited you're here. Happy Tuesday. Oh, there's 2 people here. That's exciting. Hello, whoever else entered. Welcome. But I accidentally started a little bit early, but that's okay. Most of it's just been an intro. Oh, continuing about the stream. This is a very chill stream. To anyone who didn't know, I will be chatting side to side, just like with the chat, like I did now. Making comments about the book, asking questions occasionally. Oh, welcome! Chick Chick Kiki. Did I say that right? Chi Chi Kiki. Welcome. I'm glad you could catch it live too. I'm excited you're here. This is Danmei, which is BL. Surprise to anyone that didn't know. But we are still in the very near beginning of it. So if that's a problem, please don't make it one. Thank you and good night. No. Just be chill. We're here for a good time. A little kind of now that's I don't own anything except for this physical copy in front of me and my time. I'm not claiming anything. The people who wrote this own it. Not me. But yes. Okay. Oh, we have 3. That's exciting. So before I begin reading, I generally like to do a little bit of a summary of what happened last time because we are meeting days apart. So basically what happened is they gathered kind of the young and healthy onto a train without their knowledge that they were basically being sent away from the city because more infected insectoids, xeno oh my goodness, it's been a little bit. Xenogenics broke through the one city that they thought was safe, and it is not. So now we are on a train going out of the city and witness just this massacre from District 6. So yeah. At the very moment its last coach left outer city area, a massive mushroom cloud rose from District 6. So they just blew up the city, it sounds like. And with that note, we are starting book 2, Roses. Chapter 14. The system of human sciences is all but worthless. That's not a good sign when that's the title to the chapter. After 10 minutes of high-speed train travel, the city had been completely left behind. Once Lu Feng took back his right hand, Anji saw thick clouds in the direction they had come from. The fighter planes, returning to their base, passed over the train with a roar before disappearing from his field of vision. Ooh, that's what happened. He said nothing. After quietly watching for a short while, he returned to his original spot and sat down. The moment he boarded, he was still thinking that once communication was restored, he'd use his communicator to tell Mr. Shaw where he was going. But now it seemed that it would no longer be necessary. Oh, that's right, Mr. Shaw. Oh, that's rough. He looked outside with his chin resting on his hands, and in his peripheral vision there was a black figure. Lu Feng had sat down one seat away from him, and the young judge who always followed him sat down at his side. "Colonel, a message from the trial court," he said. "Of the trial court, 21 people have evacuated, 9 people died, and 4 people were infected and have already been exterminated." Lu Feng said, "What about the City Defense Agency?" "No data at present." Then their voices ceased. Anji looked out the window the whole time, but in truth, there was nothing outside the window that was worth looking at. In the rain and fog, all that was visible was the vast and barren cement ground. It was a buffer zone. From the city gates to the outer city, and even between each one of the outer city districts, there were huge buffer zones where no buildings whatsoever had been built. This was so that, as soon as a xenogenic invasion or large-scale warfare occurred, the buffer zone could buy valuable rapid response time for the military instead of allowing xenogenics to change direction into densely populated residential areas. Before long, there was movement in the coach as Colin regained consciousness after his brief fainting spell. He got up from the aisle, returned to his original spot, and sat down, his face pale. Head bowed, he took out a pair of black-rimmed glasses from his pocket and repeatedly polished them with the hem of his shirt without saying another word. That moment, Anji felt that this boy was no longer the same person as when they first met. He turned back and looked at Lu Feng. The exact same time, Lu Feng looked away from Colin and at him. Sorry if you're hearing like a little fizziness. That's my sparkling water next to this. I'm trying to move it away a little bit. At that exact same time, Lu Feng looked away from Colin and at him. Their eyes met, and Anji uneasily grabbed the hem of his own shirt. Lu Feng only gave him a flat glance before breaking eye contact. He felt the current Lu Feng was very unfamiliar, even though they had slept in the same bed last night. After some thought, Anji still said, "What's next?" Lu Feng said, "Based on the courses you studied before, you might go teach children how to read." "Then what about you?" Lu Feng said, "I'll obey the main city's plans." Anji mustered up his courage. "Will you go to the lighthouse?" He knew his spore was likely at the lighthouse. Lu Feng looked at him. Anji felt that this seemed to be the look he would give to someone slow in the head. "I'm part of the military," Lu Feng said. "My next task is to recover the dispersion center." "Oh." Then Anji said in a small voice, "Good luck." Lu Feng quietly looked at him for a few seconds. "Thank you." After that, neither of them spoke further. Somehow, Anji felt that the colonel may not have been in much of a mood for conversation. The city just blew up. I don't think anybody's in a mood for conversation right now, let's be honest. After yet another dozen or so minutes, the train arrived at the station and Lu Feng walked towards the front line of the train. At the same time, an announcement was broadcast within the train. "Passengers, to ensure the safety of the main city, please form a line for a second inspection." The people in the train began to line up, and Anji and Colin were at the very back. The second inspection was a genetic examination using machines, and the inspector was still that young blonde and blue-eyed doctor in the white coat. After Anji and Colin had their blood drawn, the doctor started the machine and said, "Wait 5 minutes." Anji obediently pressed a cotton swab to the spot where his blood had been drawn as he stood to one side. Doctor smiled. "It's you again." "Hello," Anji said. "So the arbiter would actually bring people over for genetic examinations," the doctor said with a click of his tongue. "Everyone in our examination office was surprised," she said. "He believes that I'm human now." "He may have just wanted to nitpick," the doctor shrugged. "People of the trial court, you know, there'll always be minor problems with their minds." And G said, "He's all right." Doctor tossed an admiring gaze at him. "You're the first person I've met who will speak on behalf of Colonel Liu." The doctor spoke. His gaze moved to Anji's left arm. "You got hurt?" Anji noticed that because his movements were rather large, his sleeve cuff had been pulled up and some of the bandages wrapped around his left arm peeked out. "Mm-hmm," Anji said. "You should change the dressing," the doctor then picked up a nearby medical kit and pulled out a new roll of bandages. "I'll change it for you." The doctor seemed to be an easygoing and kind person. Anji murmured, "Thank you." As the doctor took off Anji's original bandage, she said offhandedly, "This knot was well tied." Anji thought for a while, but didn't say anything. He decided to not tell the doctor that Lu Feng had wrapped it for him, for fear that the examination office would be surprised yet again. They seemed to believe Lu Feng was an evil person with no uncrossable line. Once this thought popped up, Anji suddenly frowned. That moment, he seemed to understand why Lu Feng seldom conversed with others. The position of arbiter was destined to be like this. Just as he had that thought, he heard Colin softly say from next to him, "Doctor?" The doctor finished wrapping the bandage for Anji and looked at him. "Now that the outer city has completely fallen, there's no need for the trial court anymore either," Colin said. "Can we know the principles behind the trial court's judgments now?" As Anji thought that Colin was indeed a steadfast member of the opposition party. "Why do you want to know?" The doctor leaned against the instrument-bearing vehicle with arms crossed, looking at him as he said, "Did you have family members or friend who Lu Feng killed?" "My mother," Colin said. "That time she went into the wilderness, she hadn't gone out of the armored vehicle the entire trip. Although there are very few tiny monsters, they are by no means non-existent. But there was nothing abnormal with her appearance or behavior." "Uh-huh," the doctor said flatly. "So? If every single person's relatives demanded an explanation from the trial court and the examination office, we wouldn't have any time to ensure the safety of the city gates." "But it's different now. You guys have time now," Colin raised his voice. "We only want to know the reasons." While watching him, the doctor smiled. "You're right. It is different now," the doctor said softly. "Now you are people of the main city, so you'll gradually come to know a lot of information." He nonchalantly said, "Do you guys think that after being infected, that human bodies will slowly be corroded?" Helen said, "What else?" "That's not it." Doctor lifted his head and looked up at the sky. "At the very moment infection occurs, your strands of DNA, all the DNA structures, will instantly change. Once infection occurs, a person's fate is sealed." "Impossible," Colin said. "I've studied biology. Viruses need time to spread. There will be incubation periods." The doctor interrupted him straight away. "Following that, the DNA strand structure will affect the position of RNA, and the changes in RNA will affect the manufacture of proteins, and humans' biological characteristics will begin to change. All of these things begin happening within a very short span of time. Your skin, appearance, expressions, how you move, how you think, language ability, all of them will change. All of the training judges receive before formally becoming judges is to observe these differences with the naked eye. He smiled. Once their differentiation accuracy reaches 80%, they can graduate and formally serve. Do you think your shallow observation of human behavior is comparable to their more than 10 years of training? 80%. Colin abruptly lifted his gaze. So the trial court cannot completely identify xenogenics either. They really do ensure they won't erroneously let xenogenics pass via large-scale random killings, right? I'm very sorry, but there's something I must tell you. The doctor looked at him. Lu Feng's result that year was 100%. Colin dumbly stood in place for a few seconds before saying, "Impossible. I hope you don't use ordinary standards to determine the upper limits of other people's abilities, especially after entering the main city." The doctor's tone of voice was flat. He was speaking to Colin, but he was looking at Anji. The very least, under circumstances where it could be tested whether the judgment outcome was correct or not, he has not made a mistake even once. The examination office and the trial court have a very close relationship. I've seen his examination results. Back then, the arbiter received full marks on all indicators. However, that may not be the reason why he can determine xenogenics with 100% accuracy either. He seems to have an innate gift, a kind of intuition, the doctor said. Back then, after discovering his talent in this field, the examination office drew his blood every month. But unfortunately, their research bore no fruit. No, Colin frowned deeply. This goes against science. Intuition can't be used as the basis for science, and what you said about the infection methods, the very start also. There was a brief beep, and a green light lit up on the machine. "Here's your new ID cards and communicators. Get on the shuttle. Main city will allocate living quarters to you." The doctor handed them 2 blue chips and communicators. "Afterward, wait for information from the communicator." Colin accepted the item. "But I know it goes against some principles of biological science. The most fearsome part of this era is," as the doctor looked at him, his azure eyes, I always have trouble with that, azure eyes, seemingly frosted over. He said one syllable at a time. "We've discovered that the system of human sciences are all but worthless. Human science is like mountain climbing, but 100 years old. 100 years ago, we lost our footing." The doctor smiled. "Just like how we weren't able to explain from then until now why the geomagnetic field would suddenly disappear for such a long time." He was no longer talkative. "Get going, then." Colin bowed his head and walked towards the shuttle without another word. After Anji bid the doctor goodbye, he boarded the shuttle as well. Lu Feng's location was a mystery, for Anji hadn't seen him. He's a very busy man, and it also seemed that he didn't want to interact with Anji much today, so he had probably already left. After confirming the last 2 people had boarded, the shuttle bus left the train station along the track. It was the last bus, and it was packed tight with close to 100 people, all standing inside. The place they set out for was inside the building, so the situation outside was not clearly visible. It wasn't until 3 minutes later, when the shuttle passed through a tunnel, that the sound of rain and the light from the outside world came up. Up ahead, it suddenly became clear, and from within the vehicle came the sound of faint gasps. Anji's gaze passed through both the crowd inside, the vehicle, and the vehicle's window. There was another buffer zone, but right after the buffer zone, countless large gray-blue buildings that shone with a glassy sheen rose up. His eyes slowly opened wide. 1 month ago, the first time he came to the human base, he felt the mysticality of human buildings. They were taller than the vast majority of giant mushrooms, unusually magnificent and lofty. But those were the magnificent and loftiness with regards to a mushroom who had never seen the world. It was different now. As someone who had become accustomed to the building standards of the outer city, he once again felt that those skyscrapers were looking down at him. The outer city's residential buildings were mainly 10 stories high, but the buildings here were different. For he counted to 30 because it took so long. That building had already retreated and disappeared from his field of vision, while he had only counted a little over half of it. So he's seeing real skyscrapers. At the same time, they were unusually concentrated together and intricately interwoven, dazzlingly. Hang on. At the same time, they were unusually concentrated together and intricate, interweaving dazzlingly in Anji's sight. The rain gradually lightened up, for summer storms always left very quickly. Golden sunlight penetrated through the clouds and shone off of the glass curtain walls at the top of the buildings. Anji once heard the entire story of how the base was established from Poet's mouth. First, it was the weakening and then disappearance of the geomagnetic field. To solve this problem, humans built 2 magnetic field generators, and the northern base's main city protected one of them. It wasn't until afterward, when the mutation of bacteria and plants and animals occurred, that humans began gathering together to save themselves, which led to the emergence of the entire northern base. Therefore, the main city was established earlier than the outer city, and many things had not yet happened at that time. The magnetic generator and the main city were the pinnacles of human technology and construction, respectively, at that time. After that, it all went downhill. The robotic guide's voice said, "Passengers, due to the scarcity of housing in the main city, the residential areas affiliated with the Lighthouse and the Garden of Eden are at full capacity, so you will be temporarily placed in the military residential area. Please find the corresponding address based on your ID card number and await further instruction." Anji took out his new ID card. The card number had changed. Now it was 31240433702. 3 represented the human base, 1 represented the main city. The remaining numbers delineated the exact residential location. The people within the shuttle began to whisper amongst themselves, and they discovered that their addresses were all very scattered. "I got it," someone said. "There's no danger to the people working in the lighthouse and the Garden of Eden. They won't die, so the residential areas are at full capacity. But the military's numbers are often depleted, leaving many spaces, so they're perfect for us to be stuffed into." The other people all agreed with this view. Before too long, the shuttle stopped and let them out. There were a few others living in Building 24's Unit 04 with Anji. They walked into the building and began learning how to use the elevators in a flurry. Those were something the outer city did not have. Finally, Colin got off at the 36th floor, and Anji came alone to the 37th floor. There were no other buttons above 37, as it was the top floor. 2 doors faced each other, both with white seals pasted on them. Anji tore off the seal on the door to number 2, then swiped his card and entered. The living spaces in the main city were clearly larger than those of the outer city. This was a suite with a bedroom and a living room, and it had a separate bathroom and kitchen. The living room was a simple tea table and small gray sofa. On the wall facing the small sofa hung a black rectangular object. The rectangle's structure and color reminded him of the tablet he had played with at Mr. Shaw's place. He went up to it and pressed the button at the bottom. have safely been transferred into the main city. The main city has entered a state of emergency defense. The United Front Center has expressed that the base will enter a 5 to 10-year withdrawal period until the next generation matures. At the same time, the lighthouse has surmised that the monsters outside have produced high intelligence mutants and that the swarm's invasion is the collective actions of insects in the midst of their breeding season. To avoid the potential danger of gene leakage, the Lighthouse recommends that the United Front Center carefully dispatch troops to the outside, no longer carry out high risk operations, shift their work focus to the production of resources and combat readiness research and development, and search for ways to overcome the current predicament. Next, we turn to Lighthouse researcher Mr. Chen. The interface changed from a suit clad broadcaster to a middle aged man with a serious expression clad in a white coat. As everyone knows, anthropod class monsters do not necessarily have a survival advantage in high risk areas, but during their breeding season, they need nutrient rich, and genetically advantageous animal blood and flesh to serve as breeding grounds for their eggs. We surmise that this is why they have collectively attacked the human base. After all, reproduction is the first priority of the species, so they can do anything. But how they produced an intelligent group consciousness is unknown. We fear it may be related to some of the individuals in absorbing human genes. The broadcaster asked, "Regarding the situation, what would you like to convey to everyone?" "It is a misfortune that the entirety of the base's outer city has been lost. But in the end, we have eliminated the possibility of further human gene leakage and left the monsters no opportunity to reproduce," which is also a form of victory. Very much lore. The researcher said, "What I want to tell everyone is there is currently no need to worry about the safety of the main city. The main city is the crystallization of the pinnacle of human technology. The degree of its security is such that it will not be invaded by the monsters of the outside world. At the same time, there is no need to be anxious over the future of the human species. I have received news that our reproduction technology has advanced, and that the number of newborns in the Garden of Eden, oh God, has sharply increased in recent years, so the base is about to enter a period of population expansion. Our future is bright." The researcher spoke at length, generally focusing on placating the people. After he finished, the broadcaster connected to someone from the military and asked him, thank you. Someone connected to someone from the military and asked him to introduce the most recent progress of the workout in the field to everyone. Anji thought that the main city's news broadcasts were much more detailed than the outer city's monotonous broadcasts. He felt that it was very interesting. Once the news finally finished broadcasting, the screen turned a dull gray and began playing meaningless music, and only then did he turn it off. I appreciate it. I thought it would add a little pizzazz. It was now evening. Outside the bedroom window, stars had begun to appear, and a black silhouette in the shape of a massive cylindrical tower stood in the distance. It was too big, occupying almost a quarter of Anji's field of vision, and taller than all the other buildings, resembling a huge monster hibernating in the middle of the city. Thin aurora swiftly fluctuated around it, and Anji thought that perhaps it was the legendary magnetic field generator. He watched for a while longer, then opened the door with the intention of going out for dinner. The main city was just like the outer city, with communal dining rooms on certain floors. He noticed that the seal on the neighbors across the hallway had been torn off. Anji had no intention of investigating when his neighbor had come back, nor what kind of person they were. Stay had a hair-raising beginning, and he didn't like it. He intended for it to come to a quiet conclusion. Thus, he achieved his wish and quietly reached the next morning. Message had come from his communicator requesting all civilian personnel transferred from the outer city to gather at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. Last night, Anji read the map of the main city and the base handbook, so he knew the main city had 20,000 permanent adult residents, 70% of whom belonged to the military, and the remaining 30% consisted of scientific research personnel and various kinds of civil servants. The periphery of the main city was composed of the military areas, military bases, landing fields, train stations, and residential areas, while the interior was the core area, containing 3 of the base's important institutions. The first one was the United Front Center, the military, and it was responsible for managing military personnel and materials. The second one was the Scientific Research Center, which had the same function as its name. Because its symbol was a simplified lighthouse, it also was simply called the Lighthouse. The United Front Center and the Lighthouse each had its own large building, and the two of them were connected by corridor bridges. The buildings that were composed of were called the Twin Towers. Oh boy. The third one's name was rather long. It was called Reproduction, Nurturing, and Education Center, and it had 2 functions. One was to produce foodstuffs and nutrition for the base. Anji thought that this may be where humans planted potatoes. The other was to grow their younglings. Human babies grew up and received their initial education here. Because the name was too difficult to pronounce, it was also known as the Garden of Eden. Anji's future workplace was the Garden of Eden. He looked at the distant Twin Towers, then looked at Garden of Eden. In truth, he was looking forward to it a little, because he hadn't seen human younglings before. His spore was a very soft and white little thing. He didn't know if human younglings would be the same. But could taking care of human younglings allow him to accumulate experience, taking care of his own youngling? It seemed that it couldn't. Okay, that is the end of chapter 14. There was kind of a lot going on there. Like, we arrived in the city, got a placement, learned a little bit of the lore, as you mentioned, and kind of now are going to see kind of the meat of the city, it sounds like. Right, just a sec. Seeing if sparkling water is better for my throat than the tea was. And I'm glad you liked my scientist voice. I tried very hard. All right. Chapter 15. Do not go gentle into that good night. Ooh, we're bringing back classic literature. So fancy. Do not go gentle into that good night. Anji and Colin walk through a long and narrow white corridor. Right? Poetry. From next to them came the synchronized sound of recitation, an assemblage of very young voices creating faintly discernible echoes in the surroundings. This was the 6th floor of the Garden of Eden, and the one who brought them in was a man around 30 years old named Lin Zhu. Oh boy. I think it's Lin Zhu. Zhao? Maybe Zhao. Lin Zhao. Z-U-O. Shu? Lin Shu? We're going to go with Lin Shu. In his white shirt and gold wire-rimmed glasses, he looked gentle and cultured. Lin Shu brought the 2 of them to the office, where he said, "It's nice here, isn't it?" Colin said, "It's very nice." Lin Shu said, "The main city's conditions are somewhat better than those of the outer city." She noticed, at the very least, when he was in the outer city, he never thought that the world would have a building as massive as the Garden of Eden. In this corridor, apart from the office, there were 10 rooms altogether. 5 were classrooms, and the other 5 were children's dormitories. The dormitories were packed with small, low beds, and each room could accommodate 100 people. That would be noisy. 100 children in one room, like their bedroom. That would be loud. According to Lin Zhu, this floor of the Garden of Eden consisted of a total of 10 such corridors, and the children on each floor were the same age. Yeah, boarding school nightmare. That's exactly what that sounds like. In other words, there were 4,000 nearly 6-year-old human younglings here. Teacher nightmare. That's a lot of kids. After the children reached 6 years old, the vast majority of them originally would have been sent to the outer city to await adoption. But now that the outer city has fallen, the main city has to bear the work of their education past 6 years old, and that's not enough manpower. It's good that you all have come, he said. We dare not hand over babies under the age of 6 to newcomers, so this group of children will be assigned to you after they turn 6. G said, Okay. At present, the plan for the next step in their education isn't quite set just of yet. You two, come with me and familiarize yourself with the process first, okay? I'm making him posh-ish. Colin replied with an affirmative sound. Lin Zhu smiled faintly, then took some books from a bookshelf. These are the textbooks and shift plans. Take a look at them first, then ask me if you have any questions. Anji accepted his portion. There were 2 education courses here, with one course being language and literature, and the other course being mathematics and logic. What he received was the language and literature textbook. The 6-year-old children had already grasped basic pinyin and grammar, so the textbook contained some short fables and poems. Anzi had learned these things very well, so there was no syllabus or words Anji didn't recognize either. After flipping through the textbook once, it was time for class. Anji moved a desk and chair into the back corner of the classroom and sat down, holding a copy of the children's seating chart. The task Lin Shu gave to him, other than listening to the class, was to take notes on the children's behavior. If a child took the initiative to answer a question or ask a question, points would be added, and if a child whispered or did irrelevant things, points would be deducted. God, it really is a boarding school nightmare. When he sat in, the younglings all turned their heads to look at him. The younglings had very tender skin, and their gazes were also pure and clean. They all wore white shirts, black shorts, and similar short hairstyles, so there was momentarily no way of differentiating between male and female. They whispered a little, continuing to examine Anji, and Anji smiled at them in response. Thus, a few of the younglings smiled back at him as well. Among them, one blinked, eyelashes fluttering a few times, and asked, Are you the new teacher? Anji said, I am. Wow, another youngling said in a small voice. You're so pretty. Anji said, Thank you. The youngling said, You're welcome. Nope, we're not doing that voice. Yet another youngling asked, What are you called? Anji gave his name. Chattering, the younglings introduced themselves as well. I'm called Bai Nan. I'm called Jin Sha. I'm called Dun Chang. Of course, there were some indifferent younglings as well, such as the one in the corner who turned back after one look at Anji. But the excitement around Anji didn't last too long because Lin Shu had come in. The younglings instantly dispersed from Anji's side and returned to their own seats. Lin Shu looked around and, after confirming that nobody was absent, began the lecture. What he lectured on was the poem Anji had heard in the corridor earlier and was also the last one in the textbook. It was somewhat more complicated than the other contents, and it just happened to be what he heard the children in the classroom reciting when he walked in the corridor. The younglings first read the poem out loud from the beginning to end. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words have forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. After reading it out loud once, Lin Shu stood in front of the podium and asked, "Is there any part you don't understand?" One youngling raised their hand, and Anji checked the seating chart. This youngling was Bai Nan. Bai Nan said, "I don't understand any part." The other younglings all laugh. Ha ha ha. "Narrow the scope of your question," Lin Shu said. Then Bai Nan scratched the back of his head. His tone was hesitant as he asked, "Why can't we go gentle into the night?" Anji added a point for Bai Nan on the chart and looked at Lin Shu, waiting for his answer. He didn't know the answer to Bai Nan's question either. In the abyss and in the human base, he had seen twilight gradually replace the daylight too many times. Every single night gently descended upon the ground in that manner, unable to be resisted. Lin Shu's gaze swept over them, and his lips pursed slightly to form a faintly solemn arc. "This is the last text of your course this year," he said. "It has a meaning different from all previous texts, although to you all it may be a bit difficult." Turned around, wrote down the line, "Do not go gentle into that good night." The whiteboard, then once again turned toward the younglings below. "This is a poem composed of metaphors and symbols," Lin Shu said. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Its implied meaning is, do not meekly accept destruction." Anji slowly opened his eyes wide, and he wrote down this sentence in his notebook. Then Lin Shu began explaining from the first line, and Anji earnestly took notes. After he finished explaining, the younglings once again read the poem out loud from beginning to end. "There on the sad height, curse, bless, me now with your fierce tears I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night." The tip of the pen Anji was using paused. He lifted his head to look at the bright scenery outside the window. Nearby, the twin towers were shining gloriously beneath the sunlight, and the city gently sprawled, its edges disappearing into the blue horizon. He knew that this city had not yet gone into that good night, and was striving to not go into that good night. After the day's classes ended, Lin Shu was off work, so he handed over the children to Anji and Colin. They had to take the younglings together with the dormitory teacher to eat, then gather in the dormitories to watch the day's news. In order to improve his relationship with the younglings, Anji had to explain any confusion they had regarding the news at any time, and he could only get off work after the news was done playing. The well-fed younglings were very lively. In the corridor, they quarreled and talked. Anji felt like there were 10,000 mosquitoes screaming in his ear, but he tolerated these human younglings. Even in the abyss, monsters would treat their younglings gently, but only their own. Once it was time for the news, the dormitory teacher took out a scoring sheet, and the younglings instantly quieted down when they saw the sheet and spontaneously formed a ring next to the large projection screen with Anji sitting in the middle. As he watched the screen, he suddenly felt something touching his fingers. When he looked down, he saw it was the youngling named Bai Nan, sitting next to him and hooked his own fingers around Anji's. Anji didn't have much physical contact with humans before. The one incident he had a strong recollection of was when he bumped into Lu Fang and even hurt his head on the badge on Lu Fang's chest. But the youngling's body was different from Lu Fang's. It was soft. Like his spore, the human younglings quietly stayed by him, just like how his spore quietly stayed inside his body. Through this fantasy, Anji obtained a false sense of peace, and he once again rubbed Bai Nan's head. Thus, Bai Nan scooted even closer to lean firmly against him and hugged his arm. At the same time, another youngling named Ji Sha leaned over as well. This youngling looked vaguely like a girl. Immediately afterwards, The group of younglings wiggled towards him. Colin, who was to one side, also received the affection of a few younglings. Getting close to adults seemed to be an instinct of all species younglings. But there was a solitary youngling still sitting cross-legged in place, remaining unmoved. She remembered that his name was Sinan. Sinan never asked questions in class either. He made eye contact with Sinan and smiled at him. But Sinan avoided his gaze, turning his eyes back to the big screen. The news started. After the bombing of District 6, the number of monsters in the outer city has significantly decreased. The military's 2nd Air Formation took flight at 6 a.m. this morning and landed in District 1 to assist the outer city. The trial court's Colonel Lu Feng will command the existing troops to carry out the Dispersion Center recovery mission. Anji suddenly heard a familiar name. Since he came to the main city, he hadn't seen Lu Feng. Turned out that he had already gone to the outer city. Bai Nan suddenly murmured, "It's the Arbiter." Ji Sha said, "I'm so scared." Anji asked them, "What's the matter?" Bai Nan said, "The news will often say how many people the Arbiter executed." Ji Sha added, "He also often goes to the Abyss. The Abyss is so scary." Ji rubbed her head. "There's no need to be afraid." Ji Sha wrinkled her nose. "You're human, so the Arbiter will protect you." Ji Sha continued wrinkling her nose. Bai Nan asked, "Teacher, have you seen the Arbiter before?" The same time, the news said, "Next, we'll connect with our war correspondent." With a flash, the camera lens showed the reporter interviewing an officer clad in a black uniform. When the figure first appeared, Anji thought it was Lu Feng, but then he noticed that it wasn't. That person was the young judge by Lu Feng's side. The news screen showed his name, Sarang. "Then how does he look? He hasn't shown his face on the news before," Bai Nan asked. Ji Sha chimed in too. "Does he look very mean?" The younglings all looked in their direction, seemingly very interested in the question. Ji recalled Lu Feng's appearance and strove to decide based on human aesthetics. "He's a little fierce, but very handsome." "What does he look like?" Each of the younglings' questions were more difficult than the previous. Anji didn't know what kind of comparison to make at all. Just as he was pondering deeply, he suddenly recalled the color of Lu Feng's eyes, that cold, deep green, like where the aurora proliferated in the sky. He said, "Like the aurora, I suppose." Doubts appeared in the youngling's eyes. They're like, "X to doubt. I doubt it. You lie." Right then, Anji saw the dormitory teacher give him a thumbs up from the side. "As expected of a language and literature teacher," the dormitory teacher said. Anji didn't know if the dorm teacher was praising or criticizing him, so he could only give a closed-lipped smile. In this manner, he passed the days in the main city, one at a time, and without even noticing, he had lived here for nearly a month. Life in the Garden of Eden was very peaceful. That is such a weird phrase to say. Life in the Garden of Eden was very peaceful, with nothing more than arguments and fights between the younglings. There were a few times when Anji walked to the base of the Twin Towers, but those two towers both required for a card to be swiped before entering, and he did not have the permissions to enter. If he wanted to see his spore, he first needed to know where exactly it was within the lighthouse. Also needed to be able to gain entry to the lighthouse. Right now, both goals were far off. However, at the same time, the information that came from the news was increasingly heartening. 10 days ago, Colonel Liu had led a team into the core of the Dispersion Center and worked out a detailed plan of action. The news stressed that because of the trial court's periodic training in the Abyss, They had an extreme abundance of experience in dealing with monsters. 5 days ago, the troops officially recovered the dispersion center, cleaned out the remaining monsters inside, and carried out large-scale cleaning and disinfection. The team sent by the lighthouse then entered and began the emergency repairs. Today, Anji had originally planned to continue listening to the news, but on this day, Lin Shu had to take the night shift, so he was forced to leave work ahead of time. 1 second. Okay. At 6 o'clock in the summer, the sun was still very bright, with only the western sky being slowly suffused with this thin layer of gray-blue. Anji swiped his card, and the Garden of Eden building's glass door slowly slid open. He walked out, and Colin, who had also gotten off work early, walked out as well. It wasn't the conventional time to get off work, so there were very few pedestrians on the road. He wandered about the street and took a shortcut towards the shuttle bus stop. He and Colin were both tired of the other, so even though they had to walk the same path, they maintained a very large distance, with one in front and one behind. The world was originally very quiet, but just as he was about to cross the small street and set foot on the wide road, hurried footsteps suddenly came from behind him, followed by a white shape passing him in his peripheral vision. Short white figure, and Hansi frowned as he looked. That was a little girl, he was convinced. Of the children in his class, the ways the boys and girls dressed and looked were very similar. But they were all 5 or 6-year-olds. This child before his eyes was undoubtedly a girl. She had an exceptionally slim body and shoulder-length black hair that hung loose, and she wore a white gauze dress. Ahead was the road, and vehicles were driving over it. Anji said, Be careful. Sorry, I read ahead. Be careful. Coincidentally, a car roared as it passed by, and the girl stopped dead in her tracks, as though startled by it. She rapidly gasped for breath. She turned back to look at Anji, gazed terrified, yet seemingly very apprehensive. Anji asked, Do you need my help? Are you from the Garden of Eden? Unexpectedly, just as he finished speaking, the girl's tension increased instead, and she whipped her head around before rushing straight towards the road. Anji chased after her. That very moment, a black figure appeared at the road corner, and with crisp and tidy movements blocked the girl's path. Right as the girl's footsteps paused, that person leaned down and picked her up, then took a few steps back. The girl struggled violently, but she couldn't get free at all. Anji, who had only just arrived, was speechless. Their eyes met. Hello, Anji said. Hello, Lu Feng replied. She wanted to ask him if the dispersion center had been recovered, but at that moment he had something even more important to say, and had already been fermenting for a month. That day on the train, Lu Feng was in a bad mood. In truth, his mood had never been that particularly good before. Anji inferred the reason. In this world, very few people could look at the colonel rationally. Combined with the colonel's action of sacrificing himself on the dangerous road to save the little girl just now, that statement was even more well-founded. Colonel, he said. Lu Feng seemed to lift his eyebrows slightly. What is it? The girl was still struggling. With his gaze empty and hair disheveled, it looked like there was something wrong with her. Lu Feng carelessly patted her on the back, and although the technique was very unpracticed, at the very least his intentions were good. Thus, that statement was proven right once more. Anji looked at the little girl, and then once again looked back at Lu Feng before he said sincerely, You're a good person. This time, the colonel really lifted his eyebrows, and there was a hint of a smile in the corner of his lips. But it wasn't a genuine smile. It was like he had heard Anji say some blatant falsehood instead. That's sad. In the following second, he subdued the girl with one hand and picked up his communicator with the other. Intersection 7, target captured. With those words, he gave Anji a flat look. She did not understand. That is actually the end of chapter 15. Let me see how long 16 is. Like, we're gonna read 16, but depending on if it's shortish, we might also read 17. We can read 17. It's not that long. All right. Right? Yay! Chapter 16. I don't hate you because of those things. Well, we're apparently going to have a very deep conversation in this chapter. All right. Anji stood in place. The evening wind lifted up his hair. He saw a silver car bearing a Garden of Eden logo make a screeching turn before stopping in front of them. From inside, a man in white overalls rushed over, and he took the girl from Lufeng. Thank you for your help. The expression in Lufeng's eyes was flat. Be more careful in the future. The man got back into the car. This time was an accident. Without any further words, the man pulled the door shut, and the car swiftly started up and sped towards the Garden of Eden. Lu Feng turned back. She felt a little angry. He saw Lu Feng give him a flat look before saying, evenly, I'm a good person. She finally knew how he should describe his own mood. He thought that Lu Feng had deceived his feelings. Mushrooms even had feelings. He didn't want to acknowledge this man anymore, so he turned around and walked past him onto the road. Mushrooms even had feelings. He didn't want to acknowledge this man anymore, so he turned around and walked past him onto the road. Before he had taken many steps, Lu Feng had pressed down on his shoulder. Lead the way, Lu Feng had said. I don't know how to get back to the residential area. Anji was confused. He asked, Don't you know your way around? I haven't come back in many years, Lu Feng replied. Anji thought for a while. What he said made a bit of sense. If the colonel was not in the abyss, then he was at the city gates, so he may not have stayed in the main city for at least 7 years. Whereas he himself had already stayed in the main city for a month, so he was familiar with the way back. Thus, he asked, Where do you live? Lu Feng seemed to think for a while before taking out a blue ID card from his chest pocket and handing it over. He's totally going to be the neighbor. Anji accepted it. Even the decorative pattern on the colonel's card was different from his. He looked down and saw that the back of the card had a string of numbers printed on it in gilt. So it's all fancy. 3124043701. Recalling his new ID number, Anji expressionlessly said, I'll take you there. The colonel seemed to have noticed his expression. You aren't willing to? I'm willing. Thus, with Lu Feng in tow, he sat down on the main city's free shuttle. There were seats on both sides, and the seats were arranged in connected pairs. He sat down at a window seat, and Lu Feng sat down next to him. Lu Feng was a good-looking man, and coupled with the imposing and tidy trial court uniform, was very conspicuous amongst the crowd. As a result, when they boarded, all people inside looked at them. Ji said, Get off at the last stop. Thank you, Lu Feng said. Where do you live? I live near you. All right. The original residential area for the Garden of Eden's workers was nearby, but Anji was a late addition, and the military residential area he had been assigned to was far away. The shuttle stopped and went, and almost 40 minutes passed before it reached the last stop, where he had to get off. The Garden of Eden's younglings looked very well behaved, but they actually were not, especially when they asked about this and that. At the end of the day, Anji would be lethargic for a while, such as right now. In the past, he would choose to lean against the vehicle and nap for a while, But with Lu Feng beside him today, he felt that it was better to stay awake. Thus, Anji chose to rest his chin in his hand and look at the scenery outside, such as at the Twin Towers, Garden of Eden, and other various buildings and structures. It had been 2 months since he started living in the human city, but he still felt like he was dreaming. As he looked, Anji's eyelids gradually drooped, and after that, he lost consciousness. One second. The gentle robotic announcement played. We have arrived at the last stop. Passengers, please get off in an orderly manner. We will see you next time. Lu Feng looked at Anji, who had leaned on his shoulder. The glow of the setting sun spilled in through the window, and a golden sheen suffused the ends of Anji's eyelashes. His sleeping appearance was very quiet, with the gentle rise and fall of his breathing being the only movement. He looked like he had no aggressiveness whatsoever, nor any vigilance or caution against everything outside, just like a child who had not grown up. Lu Feng thought that it wouldn't be bad if he kept sleeping like this. But immediately, the shuttle slowed down and came to a gradual stop. People on board stood up one after the other, and their footsteps sounded in the aisle. Anji opened his eyes. He had discovered that he had slept more comfortably than any other time before. His gaze slowly traveled to the side, and he saw black fabric and a silver badge. With a start, he straightened up and saw Lu Feng watching him with a gaze that was by no means cold. It seemed that he hadn't gotten angry because what had happened just now. Lu Feng said, "Let's go." Anji rubbed his eyes. He fell asleep quickly and woke up quickly as well. He followed Lu Feng off the shuttle, and the evening wind brought with it a slight chill. Pointed towards a building up ahead. Building 24 is there. Feng uttered a short word of thanks and walked in that direction. Anji followed. He's totally the roommate. They were roommates. Halfway there, Lu Feng said, "It's enough to bring me to this point." Saying nothing, Anji continued following him. At Unit 04, Lu Feng pressed the button for the 37th floor, and so Anji went up to the 37th floor via the elevator as well. Naturally, the kind of simple choice between number 1 and number 2 did not need another's directions. Anji looked to the remains of the seal that had just been torn off from the door 01 last night, thinking that even now this colonel was still unaware that his abominable conduct had been seen through long ago. Sorry. Abominable. There we go. The seal on the door of his neighbor across the room's hall, number 01, had been torn off a month ago. He had personally witnessed it. It meant that Lu Feng had stayed there for a night back then, so there was no possibility that he didn't know the way. Lu Feng made the false claim that he didn't know the way at all and wanted him to lead the way. This meant Lu Feng was completely making fun of him, making him expend worthless and unnecessary labor. Unfortunately, when he saw Lu Feng's ID card, the man's lie collapsed. At that very moment, he heard Lu Feng say, "You're very conscientious." This man truly thought he was conscientiously doing his best to lead the way. With this thought, Anji's expression became more merciless. He looked at Lu Feng, and Lu Feng looked back at him. Mimicking Lu Feng, Anji indifferently turned and came to the door numbered 02, then placed his blue ID card on the sensor. The sensor let out a crisp beep and lit up with a green light. Then there was a click as the door lock automatically opened. Anji turned back and looked at Lu Feng. Lu Feng was briefly stunned before saying, "What a coincidence." Anji's face was blank. What is it? What is it? There seemed to be a slight questioning in Lu Feng's eyes, but merely 1 second later, he seemed to understand everything. The expression in his eyes changed completely into a smile, and the corners of his lips lifted up as well. I didn't lie to you, he said. I had a night-long pre-war meeting in the main city 1 month ago, right before leaving for the outer city. The seal, Anji said. The military knew I had returned to the main city, so they sent people to come tidy up, Lu Feng said. Yep, and they were neighbors. Oh, but Anji had no plans to believe this man again. He turned around and returned home. Right at that moment, Lu Feng's door suddenly let out a piercing and hurried beep. He turned back and saw Lu Feng swiping his card, but although the correct card was clearly placed against the sensor, it glowed red. Oh, they're gonna be roommates. Lu Feng frowned. Anji looked at him with suspicion. Then he saw Lu Feng dial a number and briefly describe the current situation. The sound of an explanation came from the transmitter on the other end. After hanging up, Lu Feng looked at Anji and said, 3 years ago, the main city's ID cards were upgraded, but mine wasn't upgraded in time. She thought that he may truly have unjustly blamed Lu Feng, but the main city's roads were not complicated at all. The buildings all had conspicuous numbers. Once on the shuttle, even a mushroom like him knew where to get off. For a moment, he wavered. But in the end, for the sake of his spore, he still said, then, would you like to come to my house for now? Lu Feng readily accepted. Ooh hoo hoo. After inviting the arbiter to sit down on the sofa and then turning on the TV for him, Anji went into the kitchen. Before entering the kitchen, he asked, have you eaten? Lu Feng said that he had not. Anji's original intention for saying that this was a hint that he could go downstairs to the communal dining hall to eat, but Lu Feng's reply had a hidden meaning, that he had to cook for 2 today. Anji chopped 2 additional potatoes. The main city's communal dining hall provided both food and raw materials. In this month, he had gradually grown accustomed to cooking his own soup. It would be thicker and more delicious than that of the dining hall. After putting the potatoes and bits of smoked pork into the pot, pouring in water, and adding milk, he turned on the heat, covered the pot, and returned to the living room. The news announced that the restoration work of the dispersion center was proceeding smoothly. Lu Feng was on the sofa and looked at his textbook, seemingly in a good mood. When this man was in a good mood, he would bully others. When he was in a bad mood, he would not acknowledge others, such as that time a month ago on the train when he seemed to be completely unwilling to talk to Anji. After the impulsive emotion of being lied to subsided, Anji calmed down. While he was chopping potatoes in the kitchen, he earnestly contemplated the relationship between himself and Lu Feng. The key to finding his spore lay in establishing a good relationship with Lu Feng. The premise upon which establishing a good relationship with humans rested on on understanding his preferences. Thus, Anji sat next to Lu Feng, and he saw that Lu Feng was looking at a poem in the textbook that described autumn scenery. You teach this? Lu Feng asked. I'm still learning, Anji said. Lu Feng's unprompted question made Anji even more convinced that the man was in a good mood. Thus, he said, Colonel. Lu Feng put down the textbook and looked at him. What is it? Before, on the train, Anji murmured, slowly dropping his gaze. You seemed unwilling to acknowledge me. Did I do something wrong? Lu Feng looked at him with a deep gaze. No, he said. It's my problem. So that's what it was. Were you very bothered? After a short silence, Lu Feng reached out a hand. His fingers lingered briefly on the skin at Anji's neck, then traveled down and pulled out the bullet shell hanging around his neck. Anji lifted his head to look up at Lu Feng, slightly panicked. At what point Lu Feng discovered the existence of the bullet shell, he didn't know. I killed the black market mistress. At that time, you were by her side. Did you work under her? She shook his head. I only followed Mr. Shaw. 3260563209 at the city gates, Lu Feng continued. Was he your teammate or boyfriend? My friend. Holding the bullet shell at his neck, Lu Feng asked, Who is this? Anji said nothing. He couldn't say it, but silence was also a form of answer. After that silence, Lu Feng did not ask any further, and simply stuffed the bullet shell back beneath Anji's collar. I've killed many people. However, for the most recent mass killings, you've always been present, he said. Under these circumstances, the fact that you're still able to say I'm a good person surprises me greatly. Anji thought back and discovered that things were indeed so. The first time they had met, Lu Feng killed Vance. The second time they met, it was Jusei. That night, xenogenics had invaded the city and he'd also killed 73 other people. 1 month later, Anji stood within the isolation wall and witnessed Judgment Day being carried out with countless gunshots. Finally, on the train leaving the outer city, at his side, Lu Feng issued the order to bomb District 6. Lu Feng had killed many people he had connections to. However, this by no means impeded him from thinking that Lu Feng was a good person. Firstly, he knew Lu Feng was very accurate in distinguishing xenogenics. Secondly, even if he was recognized as a xenogenic by Lu Feng and killed, or when District 6 was bombed, he was one of them, and it seemed there was nothing to say. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. He had come to the human base, so he had to accept human rules. But Lu Feng was the person who carried out the death sentences. Are you sad because of this? Anji asked. No, Lu Feng said while looking at him. I know what I'm doing. Then Anji only managed to say that one word. Was this because of some sort of emotional fluctuation? But Lu Feng seemed to see what he was thinking. I haven't violated the principles, he said, but nobody will come to determine whether I'm right or wrong. Anji remembered what the young Judge Shirang said to him. He asked, You aren't certain whether you killed people correctly or not? No, I'm certain. Lu Feng looked out the window. His green eyes were like little ice-bound lakes, containing an empty and distant stillness. I'll just sometimes think about the choices I made. Just what am I judging, and who will judge me in the end? Anji didn't fully understand his words. When humans have gone mad, perhaps they would say some nonsense that others did not understand. But he also felt that he did understand. As he looked at Lu Feng, he said, I don't hate you because of those things. After a pause, he added, You haven't done wrong. Lu Feng looked at him, and there was a long silence. It was so long that Anji felt an illusion. Within that pair of eyes were not icebound lakes, but rather gentle cold water. Twilight slowly descended upon the room. Lu Feng reached out with his right hand and ruffled Anji's hair. That's cute. Anji lowered his eyes slightly. The feeling of being patted on the head by the arbiter was very wondrous. He felt that Lu Feng was now very soft. That's adorable. That's like so cute. When the big icy serious dude gives head pats, that's adorable. If it was because his previous words comforted this man, he would feel rather happy. Thus, he smiled at Lu Fang. Then he saw Lu Fang's gaze turn malicious, and the fingers that had patting his head moved downward and pinched his face. It's still cute. Anji felt that it was better when this man was in a worse mood, because at least then he wouldn't randomly bully others. Escape from Lu Fang. I need to go check on the pot. Uh-huh. Anji returned to the kitchen and discovered that, as expected, the water had already started boiling, with the foam surging up and almost bursting through the pot lid. These days, he had grasped a significant number of cooking techniques. Lifted the transparent pot lid, and the white steam evaporated, and the bubbles swiftly vanished. Smoked pork had been soaked through by the boiling water, and the edges of the small pieces of potato had also become rounded. The small amount of milk made the soup slightly white, and in the fresh and salty scent that wafted up, there was a subtle hint of a tender and lingering sweet fragrance. It was a smell Anji liked very much. Picked up a nearby ladle and used the bottom of it to mush the softened pieces of potato. They were stirred and mashed. The small pieces gradually dissolved into the soup, and the pot of potato soup became visibly thicker. Lu Fang had also come into the kitchen at some point. Leaning against the doorframe, he asked, "Do you want me to help?" And she naturally didn't count on the mighty colonel to be familiar with kitchen work. So he said, "No." But, yeah, my computer agrees. "No, thank you." But Lu Feng didn't leave. He stayed there and watched Anji. Then his gaze shifted to the kitchen, looking around the small space. Finally, his gaze stopped on the silver faucet over the sink. "Does it leak?" "Mm-hmm," Anji said. So the first day he moved in, the kitchen faucet leaked. No matter how tightly he turned it, water would drip. In the daytime, the sound was not obvious, but in the profound quiet of the night, when even the lights of the distant twin towers were extinguished, the repeated sound of dripping water echoed throughout the room and would sometimes disturb his sleep. Though disturbing his sleep came second. More importantly, with day after day of this, he was afraid he would have to pay a bigger water bill. Ah, the worries of taxes. I don't know. Money issues. He's such a fiscally responsible little mushroom. But then he saw Lu Feng take off and put aside his coat, roll up his uniform shirt sleeves, and lift his hands to close the black valve up on the water pipe. That was a place someone of Anji's height could not reach. Woohoo! He's rolling up his sleeve, Mr. Handyman! Then he unscrewed the faucet. Anji silently watched his movements. He felt that Lu Feng's activity had only two possibilities. One was wanting to utterly destroy his faucet, and the other was wanting to help him repair it. Rationally, he felt it was the former, but emotionally, he was more willing to believe the latter. That exact moment, someone knocked on the door. Lu Feng was taking apart the faucet. Without even lifting his head, he said, "Go." His manner of speaking was as self-assured as if he were the owner of these living quarters. Anji, the true owner, put down the ladle, went over to the entryway, and opened the door. It was a soldier clad in a military uniform. The man looked around the living room and said, "Colonel Liu had me come here." His voice was very loud. Lu Feng's calm voice came from the direction of the kitchen. "Over here." Soldier walked to the doorway, then clicked his heels and saluted. "Colonel Liu, I'm with the logistics service. Neglecting the issue with your ID card was the fault of our operating..." His words were suddenly cut off, and his gaze turned towards the faucet parts in Lu Feng's hand. The expression like he'd seen a ghost, he then continued, For this, we sincerely apologize and..." "Cut the chatter," Lu Feng said, coldly interrupting him. The soldier said, "I'm here to deliver your new ID card." "Thank you." Lu Feng didn't even look at him as he put two parts back together with both hands. "You can put it down." Potato peels lay piled up next to the sink, and next to them was the kitchen knife. In the sink was water. In the colonel's hands were faucet parts. The soldier held the ID card, momentarily unsure where he ought to put it. And she could only say in a small voice, "You can give it to me." After taking the ID card, next was seeing the visitor off. At the entrance, the soldier once again glanced at the colonel in the kitchen, then looked at Anji. He deliberately lowered his voice, but because his voice was loud in the first place, it still wasn't quite quiet after he lowered it. "What is the colonel doing?" "Fixing the faucet." "The colonel knows how to fix faucets?" The soldier looked at him with suspicion. "Then you and he are..." "Right now we're neighbors." "They're neighbors." "What about before?" Before... Anji recalled how they had slept in each other's beds. "Friends, I suppose." The corners of the soldier's mouth twitched unnaturally. Ha ha. He seemed to not believe Anji. Perhaps it was that Lu Feng very rarely took apart other people's faucets. Anji calmly sent the soldier away. As soon as he returned to the kitchen, he saw that the faucet had been reinstalled in its original place. Lu Feng twisted open the valve. The faucet did not leak at all. "Wow," she said. When he looked at the faucet, he felt that the colonel did not necessarily stay aloof at all times, refusing to acknowledge others, and also felt that the man seemed to know how to do everything. He said, "You really are amazing." His voice was still soft and very delicate. The aroma of potato soup had completely wafted out to fill the room with its dense steam. Without any hint of emotion, Lu Feng said, "You're not bad yourself." After the potato soup was completely cooked, Anji divided it into 2 bowls and matched it with 2 packets of hardtack to serve as stable food. Lu Feng looked to be in a very cheerful mood, but Anji had no appetite. He racked his brains, wanting to get some information related to Lighthouse from Lu Feng, so he asked Lu Feng no small number of questions. "What will you do next?" "Wait for plans." "Will you work in the Twin Towers?" "Maybe." "Does the Lighthouse and the military often interact?" "No." "The doctor works at the lighthouse. Do you know him very well?" "No." Lu Feng was expressionless. The blatant coldness made Anji give up the thought of continuing his questioning, but to stop there seemed more suspicious, so he continued. "That little girl today." In the following second, Lu Feng looked at him. "Don't ask questions you shouldn't be asking," he said, "and don't talk while you're eating." "Is he Alan?" "Sounds like Alan. No talking while eating. If you know, you know." Anji disappointedly shut up. By the time dinner ended, he hadn't gotten anything related to his sport at all, but the arbiter's attitude towards him seemed to have improved a lot. Anji opened his door to see Lu Feng out. Lu Feng said, "Goodbye," and Anji also said, "Goodbye." Saw Lu Feng put the new ID card up to the sensor. The green light lit up and the lock successfully opened. Lu Feng pushed the door open. Then he suddenly stopped moving, his entire person seeming to have come to a standstill. For the colonel, this kind of behavior was very solemn scene, so Anji surreptitiously stuck out his head and looked inside the room. With a look, he froze as well. Huh. The room was not empty. Next to the sofa that directly faced the entrance was a huge open suitcase, and on the sofa was an officer in a black uniform sitting upright. This officer had black hair and green eyes and was coldly looking at the doorway. The Lu Feng standing in the doorway turned and looked at Anji with an identical gaze. "It wasn't me," Anji said. "It's the doll! It's the sex doll!" It truly wasn't him. Since his arrest, he had never seen the Arbiter's mannequin again, and he even assumed that the evil thing had been blown to bits along with District 6. Why would it appear in Lu Feng's home? The exact moment Lu Feng's communicator rang, the other person's voice was very loud, for it was the soldier from the logistics department who had come earlier to deliver the card. Colonel, have you returned to your living quarters? Can the new ID card be used normally? It can, thank you, Lu Feng said, but I wish to know, what is going on with the mannequin in my living room? The mannequin? The soldier on the other end was first a little uncertain, but then he suddenly had an epiphany. Oh, before, during the trial court's emergency evacuation. For saving important documents and goods, and the soldier responsible saw this and believed it may be an important military tool, so they brought it over. We didn't know how to deal with it, so we put it in your living quarters. Lu Feng repeated a sentence. Important military tool? Indeed. Although we're in the main city, we also know the outer city had some reactionary groups opposing the trial court. We judged the replica mannequin to perhaps be one of the trial court's tools to bait the enemy. Moreover, its manufacturing cost looks to be very... The man talked endlessly. Lu Feng didn't say a word. The other person finally noticed that something was amiss. Colonel, did I say something wrong? You haven't, thank you. Lu Feng hung up. After hanging up, he said to Anji, Come here. Anji felt deep despair. He had not been convicted in his previous case, and it was only because of a sudden worm attack that he was able to get out of prison. Now that the dirty deeds reappeared, would the arbiter bring up the past again and convict him? He walked over. Feng carelessly picked up the mannequin from the sofa, put it back in the suitcase, then pushed the suitcase towards Anji. Uncomprehendingly, Anji pressed down on the suitcase handle. For you, Lu Feng said, leaving Anji at a loss for words. He just gifted him a self-sex doll. Like, what would that mean if your crush gave you a replica sex doll that you accidentally made? Like, just like here. I don't know. I am honestly asking. On that note, chapter 16 is over. And I know it says we're only going to 16, but we are also going to bonus do number 17. Which, right, that's like, what do you do in that situation? Like, thank you? Like, all right. Chapter 17. It's like a beehive. Huh. Grasping the handle, Anji asked, stupefied, I haven't committed a crime of indecency now? No. Lu Feng turned to go back to the bedroom. Whether the crime of indecency is established or not depends on the wishes of the victim. This man had the gall to call himself a victim. G had already seen through him. After pulling the suitcase home, he put it in the most inconspicuous corner of the room. He wouldn't allow the Lu Feng inside to see the sun again. I love that he actually calls it Lu Feng instead of just mannequin. Like, it adds something. It really does. The news broadcast on the TV had just finished and transitioned into the next day's weather forecast. In a sweet voice, the anchor said that the flatland where the base was located would be welcoming a rare windy day and asked everyone to please close their doors and windows. To start, when Anji was a mushroom, he feared strong winds because they would destroy mushrooms. It wasn't until later, when he snapped and his body changed, that he slowly stopped being afraid of the wind. On the contrary, he liked the feeling of the wind blowing against him. Once he washed up, he returned to his bedroom. He looked at his textbook for a while. After the night gradually deepened, Anji planned to sleep. Right at that moment, a strange low noise sounded in his ear. Long and undulating, it resembled the sound of the wind echoing in the narrowest of canyons. Sometimes it was a very low whine, and sometimes it abruptly turned shrill. It was like the sound of the wind outside, yet also like it was coming from the inside of the whole room, but he couldn't find the sound source. This was by no means the first time he heard this sound. On many nights previous in this room, the low and distant noise was accompanied by the plip plop of dripping water, forming a strange harmony. The combination of these two sounds often gave him the illusion that he was still in the abyss. Outside the cave, wind blowing in from the depths of the dense jungle, the mucus and saliva secreted by animals or plants dripping on the moss covered rocks. That's kind of gross. Sometimes the wind and the structure of the cave produced a strange resonance, causing a low noise to sound from all directions, resembling the sleep talk of some creature. But tonight, the sound was louder than any other time before, and Anju was finally able to confirm that the origin of the sound was in his own room. He frowned, then closed his eyes and carefully perceived his surroundings. Apart from the sound of the wind outside the window, that kind of sound, the sound near him, his eyes flew open and he got out of bed. Standing barefoot on the floor, he picked up the flashlight on the table and turned it on. He got down on one knee, lifted the bed sheets, and shone the flashlight beam underneath the bed. Pitch black round hole appeared before him. So on the wall the bed was up against, around where the wall connected to the floor. The hole was the size of a human head and resembled a man-made pipe mouth. Its interior was completely dark, with nothing inside and nothing visible. He felt the wind blowing out from it. The sound that had disturbed him for a month was the sound of the wind in the pipe. After examining the hole for half a minute, Anji put down the bedsheet and climbed back up onto the bed. Human rooms always had some odd structures. To sleep early tonight, for tomorrow was a very important day. I have a feeling that's going to come bite him in the butt. Just like leaving that open. Your bodies still struggle to return. And yet the nameless wildflowers have bloomed upon your head amply. And yet the nameless wildflowers have bloomed amply upon your heads. Anji watched Bai Nan write down a poem from memory upon the exam paper. Today was the graduation exam for this group of younglings, and he was responsible for patrolling the examination room to prevent cheating. The low noise from last night also echoed in this classroom, but everyone seemed used to it. In an inconspicuous part of one of the classroom corners, Anji discovered a similar hole. It seemed that this was a commonly seen thing in human buildings. He hadn't noticed it before because it was so noisy during the day, causing the sound to be covered up, but today, the strong wind outside made the wind inside the hole stronger as well. Passing by Nan, he walked forward. Ji Shah's exam paper was a mess, full of marks from scribbles and corrections. She had only filled in a scattered few neat and tidy words in the English questions, but when Anji took a look, it seemed that she hadn't gotten many correct. Oh. Many of the younglings were in a similar situation as Ji Shah. Many of the other ones hadn't even put forth the effort to make corrections. The exam papers in front of them practically blank. Well, I mean, they're only 6. Like, what do you want? Most of the younglings were heading to make corrections. Of course, there were exceedingly few 7 or 8 younglings whose exam sheets had been filled out well. I do too. It's very cute. Very wholesome, calling young children younglings. Anji looked as he walked, and he came to a corner of the classroom next to the cold youngling named Sinan. Sinan's exam paper had already been completely filled out, although only half an hour had passed since the exam started. It was faster than everyone else. At that moment, he wasn't checking his answers nor daydreaming, but rather drawing in the blank space of the exam sheet with a black pen. In truth, it was not appropriate to call it drawing. Those were irregular black lines, and they messily tangled together, resembling the vines in the abyss, and possessing a madness that broke out of the surface of the paper. By the time the 1.5-hour exam ended, the deranged lines had already filled the entire exam sheet, and only in the answer areas could his writing still be seen. After the papers were collected, the dormitory teacher took the younglings back to the dormitory. She took the papers back to the office where Lin Shu and Colin were both inside. Lin Shu had just finished correcting the mathematics and logic exam papers. Upon seeing Anji enter, he took the papers and said, "Record the scores with Colin." Anji obediently agreed and came to Colin's side. Colin read out loud the younglings' names and grades, and Anji entered the grades into the chart on the computer. "Sinan," Colin read out loud, 100. Anji recorded his grade and said softly, "He's so amazing." He had looked over the mathematics and logics exam sheet. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division were already the simplest of its contents. Anji believed he himself might not be able to solve the geometry and logic questions. There's 6. Like, are you kidding me? I mean, it's the future, so, like, maybe they have... I don't know what they... Sure, they're doing multiplication and division. Just then, Lin Shu, who was correcting the language and literature exam paper, said, "Sinan is a very rarely seen genius." Anji said. "But I don't plan on having him enter Class A," Lin Shu said. After working with them for the past month, Anji now knew the rules governing a youngling's school promotions. The dormitory teacher had a chart for adding and deducting points, and there was one during class as well. These records of added or deducted points were added to the grades for the typical major and minor exams. The scores from the final exam added in the end, they formed the younglings' final grades. The handful of younglings with the best grades in the class would get promoted into Class A and continue receiving the main city's education. After they grew up, they would enter the main city's various organizations based on their own strengths. The other younglings would enter the military base for training and assessments, and after a month, the military would select a dozen or so Class B younglings based on the situation and continue developing them. After those younglings grew up, they would become the military soldiers. The remaining younglings would be classified as Class C and sent to the outer city to aid adoption by the outer city's residents. If nobody adopted them, they would continue living a communal life in the district assigned by the outer city and become outer city residents from then on. But Lin Shu said that he didn't plan to allow Sinan to enter Class A. Anji asked, "Why not?" "There are problems with his character," Lin Shu said. "He's also unsuited for joining the military. He lacks emotions and simultaneously harbors resentment against the base. So he cannot serve the main city. The Garden of Eden also agrees with my assessment of him. He will be assigned to Class C. I'll be counting on you two in the future." "All right," Anji said. "He's a very strange child," Lin Shu said. "The dormitory teacher told me that he often wakes up in the night and will sometimes tremble, but no cause can be found. I heard from the nanny who took care of him before he turned 3 years old that he had once lost a friend, which may have left a psychological scar." Dude, kid's got PTSD. Like, what do you want? The morning passed, and the calculations of the final grades were completed. 5 of the younglings, including Bainan, were selected and sent together with the outstanding younglings of the other classes to the Garden of Eden's 7th floor to be educated. Lin Shu was transferred to the 3rd floor and began taking care of the new first years. Anji and Colin officially became the teachers in charge of the remaining younglings. Their duty was to take the younglings to the military base and watch them take the military's training and assessments. The main city was very efficient. That very afternoon, they took a shuttle to the military training ground on one side of the city, and with them were the younglings from the other classes. The wind at the training ground was strong and brought with it fine grit, but the younglings were in high spirits. running and jumping about in the spacious grounds. The military's personnel who were in charge of screening younglings were about to come over to take over them, so Anji and Colin became idle. All they needed to do was watch from the side. As they sat side by side on the iron bench, Colin suddenly spoke. This past month, neither he nor Anji made conversation with the other. I'm willing to let go of a little of my hatred for the Arbiter now, he said. Anji looked at Colin and noticed his gaze pass through the buildings as he looked at a gray corner of the distant Garden of Eden that stuck out. It was a very cold gaze. Because the entire main city is just as cold and heartless as the Arbiter, Colin said while looking over there. How come? Anji asked. Have you seen the Garden of Eden? Colin asked. It's like a beehive. There it is, chapter. The Garden of Eden was a massive hexagonal building, and it did have some similarities to a beehive. Anji said nothing, and Colin continued talking to himself. The Garden of Eden is the queen bee, producing up to 10,000 children each year. Starting from when they're 3 years old, they're made to take difficult assessments so as to cherry pick the small portion with the highest IQ, have them stay in the main city to do scientific research or whatnot in the future. To the main city, these children are useful, are drones, so they can receive the main city's superior living conditions, he said. The others are all worker bees, and they're allocated to the outer city, where conditions are poor. Space controls the supply of food and water, and the worker bees can only become mercenaries. Only by going out to struggle in the wilderness and bring back materials can they survive. Those materials are used by the base to benefit the main city. He let out a cold laugh. Huh. This is how the entire base operates. Only people with value to the main city are people. They wouldn't feel the slightest bit of distress at blowing up District 6 because the people out of the outer city are things they have abandoned in the first place. Anji said, but the main city is significant for only a very few people to live in. Sufficient, not significant. Sorry. Colin turned towards him. Do you think what they're doing is right? After briefly hesitating, Anji nodded. You think what they're doing is right because you survived. You're standing here taking the main city's position. Anji became agitated and his chest heaved. Humankind's interests take precedence over all else, so whatever they do is right, he said. But the people who died, the people they blew up, my family and friends, what did they do wrong? Were they not human? Anji said nothing. He was by no means perplexed because of Colin's question, for the Abyss also had social creatures. Through his long-term observations, for a solitary creature, living was the most important thing. But for a group of social creatures, the continuation of the entire group was more important. He didn't think that Colin was wrong. It was simply that this person may have been more suited to living in the Virginia base. Yeah, they all died. They died together. Colin looked into his eyes, and at last he said, I get it. You don't have feelings at all. Their conversation stopped there. G turned his gaze back to the younglings once again. The younglings were much cuter than Colin. But at that moment, the younglings were in total chaos, for a fight was going on. Anji stood up and walked into the group of younglings, and Colin came over as well. The ones fighting were Sinan and a sturdy-looking boy. Sinan's were a little red as he pressed the other boy securely to the ground. Let go of him, Colin said. Sinan, I'm deducting points. Sinan still didn't let go of the boy, so Colin had no choice but to come forward and separate them by force. Adults had much greater strength than children, after all. Dude, I disagree. Have you ever tried actually taking candy from a baby? Because, like, legit, their grip strength is ridiculous. Like, I'm not saying try it, but, like, anybody who knows. Like, just saying. Sinan stood to one side, a cold expression on his face. Anji looked down at him and asked, "What's the matter with you two?" Sinan said nothing, but the other boy said loudly, "You were sleep-talking at night. You shouted at Lily's name. Lily's been taken away and locked up ages ago. In any case, you can't find her." Anji saw Sinan clench his fist. Lily. It sounded like a girl's name. He asked, "Who is Lily?" This time, Sinan finally answered him. "My friend." "Where is she?" "The Garden of Eden," Sinan said icily. Anji recalled Lin Shu saying he had once lost a friend, and guessed that was the reason for this dispute. Guessed that the reason for this dispute was because that boy had mentioned Sinan's sore spot. "Don't be angry anymore." He got down on one knee to get to Sinan's eye level and gently patted his shoulder. "I won't allow him to mention this in the future." Sinan's expression didn't change. He was clearly a youngling, but he had a coldness that was different from all the other younglings. Ji could only pat Sinan's hair and then stood up. At the training ground, the younglings were in total chaos. Colin, who was next to him, was educating another youngling, and his education was much more successful than Anji's. So long as he said the two words, "deduct points," the youngling would immediately obey him. Inspired, Anji said to Sinan, "You aren't allowed to fight in the future, otherwise your points will be deducted." The corners of Sinan's mouth curled up, and he said, "You guys don't want to let me stay in the main city anyway." At times, when the other younglings stumbled over their own words, this youngling knew everything. Anji felt helpless, but nobody could help him. That does not look like. Right at that moment, in his peripheral vision, a black car stopped and 3 people emerged from it. Anji looked over and met the eyes of the person in the middle. He blinked. Lu Feng had seen him as well. With a slight raise of his eyebrows, Lu Feng walked towards them. "You were here too?" Anji asked. "For a meeting," Lu Feng said. "What happened to you?" In Anji's voice was a hint of helplessness along with a request for help. "2 children were fighting." "Just give each one a beating," Lu Feng said. His words made Anji laugh involuntarily. Then Anji leaned down and said to Sinan, "Next time you fight, I'll beat you." Lu Feng looked at him. "You're so good-natured," he said coolly, "that not only will they continue to fight, they'll beat you too." Anji was speechless. He adjusted his expression, striving to make himself look a bit fiercer. If he had even 1/10 of Lu Feng's fierceness, everything would go smoothly when he taught the younglings. As Lu Feng looked at him, the corners of his lips curled up, and then he turned his gaze to Sinan. His gaze froze in place. "Get away from him," Lu Feng said coldly. Uncomprehendingly, Anji obeyed Lu Feng almost on reflex and backed 2 steps away. Lu Feng took 2 steps forward, placing himself between Anji and Sinan, put on gloves, grabbed Sinan's jaw, and forced the child to look at the sun. The sun was glaring, and Sinan's pupils constricted. "There's something wrong with him." Lu Feng effortlessly held Sinan in place. "Contact the lighthouse." That's the end of chapter 17. So, this has been pretty short chapters. Let me see what chapter 18 looks like. You know what? Why not? I have time tonight. We will read one more chapter, and it will be just one more this time. I know I said one more before, but yeah, that'll do it. All right, we're doing one more chapter because I don't like leaving things on a cliffhanger. Unless you want it left on a cliffhanger. Gotta speak now, though. All right, we're continuing. Chapter 18. Dr. G, you're wavering. Preliminary infection. Infection progress 20 units. 13 animal-type targets, which points to arthropod mutation. The doctor walked over, carrying a thick report, and put them in front of Lu Feng. How is it that wherever you go, there will be xenogenics? Yep. Okay, good. Lu Feng picked up the report. The doctor crossed his arms and said, I'm surprised you didn't shoot him on the spot. I'm not familiar with infection characteristics in children, Lu Feng said. Then don't kill him. Leave him for me to use as a sample. As you like. With arthropod mutations, there's not much to say. The doctor looked at the report in his hand. Why don't you go ahead and prepare for the meeting now? Since an infection has occurred in the main city, a child of Eden at that, I've already reported it. It's no small matter. Arthropod, Lu Feng said. Does it have any connection with what happened before in the outer city? The final investigation results of the outer city's insect swarm just came out today. It was determined to have been a one-time collective action of mutant insects under pressure of the breeding season. The doctor's voice was very soft and his expression was solemn. But we don't know exactly what method they used to become connected, nor if there was a commander role. But the main city is impregnable from top to bottom, so things from the outside can't get in. He took a deep breath, then thought with his eyes closed as he said, even if an accident did occur in the main city, it should have been the escape of one of the lighthouse xenogenic samples. Why was it a child from the Garden of Eden? I mean, my guess is human experimentation. Like, just saying. Someone decided to get a little too into, I can fix it, and bada bing, bada boom, mutant child. We'll see if that's true. That or someone got a little freaky with one of the xenogenics, which, I mean, look at what book we're reading. Like, it wouldn't be the first time, probably. Lu Feng looked over the report once, then looked at Anji. As Sinan's teacher, Anji bore the responsibility of going to the lighthouse with them. Oh, this is how we get to the lighthouse. What places has he been to? Lu Feng asked. He's been with the children, the other children the entire time, Anji said. When I got off work yesterday evening, they were either watching the news or sleeping. This morning, they were taking an exam in the classroom, and in the afternoon, they were at the base. Feng said, contact his teacher and dormitory teacher. Anji gave an affirmative reply. After calling Lin Shu and explaining the situation, he thought for a while and then said, I can go ask him. He's very smart. Lu Feng hummed in response. Thus, Ji walked up to the sealed glass door. As one of the infected, Sinan was isolated from other people, and his current location was a silvery white factory. Or laboratory. I don't know why I said factory. Within the laboratory, there was a small figure. Sinan sat alone on a silvery white dissection table, his head slightly bowed. He still had that same expression on his face, as if everything had happened outside had nothing to do with him. Sound came from behind Anji. Lu Feng's communicator was ringing frantically, showing the seriousness of the situation. Really, those 2 or 3 minutes, already 3 groups of people had come here to find him. Feng said something to the doctor, then got up and walked out into the corridor. There were audio devices inside and outside of the door. Anji picked up the handset. Well, that's weird. Not a headset. Handset. Sinan. Sinan looked at him. Are you aware of what happened to you? Anji asked. Sinan nodded. Then do you know the reason for it? Anji asked. In the Garden of Eden, did you ever come across anything strange? Sinan looked straight at Anji with his jet black eyes, that gaze seemingly wanting to pierce through him. In that instant, Anji suddenly understood why xenogenics and humans had differences that could be distinguished with the naked eye. That kind of gaze was like a something that was different from humans. If a pair of eyes like this existed on a monster in the abyss, he would not feel the slightest bit of incongruity. After a minute of silence, Sinan said, No. Think a little harder, Anji strove to guide the youngling. What did you do yesterday? Were you with your classmates the entire time? Sinan only looked at him with that dark gaze. No matter what Anji asked, he said nothing more. Just as they entered a stalemate, the doctor's communicator rang as well, and Anji looked over. The doctor pressed the hands-free mode button, and Lin Shu's voice came out. His tone of voice was very steady, but he spoke quickly. Anji knew this was the behavior of humans when they were forcing themselves to keep calm. We've retrieved all the footage from the past 3 days, and he's always been with the others. He'd leave the scope of the surveillance when using the restroom and during the occasional free time, but this is normal. The longest duration he was away was no more than 3 minutes, and could only move about in the corridor on our floor, Lin Shu said. There are no abnormalities in the Garden of Eden whatsoever. Could he have been infected on the way to the training base or at the training base itself? I heard that the speed of a child's infection outbreak is much faster than that of an adult. I'm very sorry, Mr. Lin. Although children are infected more quickly than adults, based on the degree of morphology change in his tissue cells, he was infected at least 15 to 20 hours ago. Lin Shu was silent for a while before he said, If that's the case, then he was indeed infected in the Garden of Eden, but the Garden of Eden's other children and teachers are all very normal, with no sign whatsoever of infection. Please do not panic, the doctor said. We're currently awaiting further orders from the higher-ups. At 3 o'clock at the latest, the lighthouse will ally with the trial court to screen for infection among the children who were moved about on the 6th floor during the period of time. Please get ready to cooperate. Lin Shu said, Okay. Thank you for understanding. If there's nothing else, the doctor said. Wait, Lin Shu said. Do you have other clues? The doctor asked. It's not a clue, but I hope it may be helpful to you, Lin Shu said. Sinan has always been a very strange child. His IQ is very high, but his state of mind has always been very dissociative. I watched him grow up, and I'm sure that there are differences in either his way of thinking or his sense compared to other children. Thank you for informing me. I will look into it, the doctor said. The arbiter has returned. We're about to set out, so let's discuss in greater detail after meeting up. Lin Shu said. All right. Lu Feng walked back into the room. How is it? The doctor asked. The Garden of Eden and the training base have already been placed under martial law, Lu Feng said. We've currently counted the number of people and will set out in 10 minutes. Okay, the doctor said. Lu Feng looked up at Sinan, who was in the laboratory. How are things on your end? The doctor shrugged. Lu Feng walked forward and stood next to Anji. Sinan's eyes slowly turned towards Lu Feng, and at that very moment Anji noticed that his black eyes, which originally had clear borders, were slowly diffusing outward rapidly, resembling threads of spiderweb extending outwards. Lu Feng said, 10 hours. Anji was stunned. He knew what Lu Feng meant. Within 10 hours, Sinan would completely change from a human youngling into an irrational monster. He called out Sinan's name again in an attempt to produce a bit of communication. But he saw Sinan's gaze fixed unmovingly on Lu Feng, and Lu Feng returned the look. Sinan opened his voice. opened his mouth. Sorry. Sinan opened his mouth. The child's voice was very youthful, but he spat out 5 words in an ice-cold tone. All of you will die. That'd be really creepy to hear in a kid's voice. Lu Feng smiled. He took the handset from Anji. There's no person who will die, he said. Humankind will survive. With that, he hung the handset back up and turned and left. Anji compared them. In terms of ice-cold expressions and tone of voice, the colonel was still superior. A few researchers took control of Sinan, and the partition door closed. The doctor said, "This child is very strange." "I'll transfer people over for questioning," Lu Feng said. "Thank you for your hard work," the doctor replied. Right at that moment, the windy noise sounded in Anji's ears again. He looked around and saw a similarly hidden round hole at the junction between ceiling and wall. "Lu Feng," Anji said as he gently tongued down Lu Feng's sleeve. "What's that?" Lu Feng followed his gaze and looked up at the ceiling, then said, "It's a vent." Anji blinked. "You haven't seen one before?" the doctor asked. "The outer city doesn't have them because it was constructed later." The doctor was always willing to explain knowledge to others, so Anji continued asking questions. "What does it do?" "It supplies air." The doctor's reply was very simple. Then he explained. The main city was constructed, the magnetic field had not yet disappeared entirely, and humankind's industrial capabilities were still at their peak. To construct a base that was capable of resisting cosmic radiation and solar winds at the maximum extent, the walls of all buildings were 4 to 5 times thicker than those of ordinary buildings, and the materials are special. They're completely closed off and rely on the ventilation systems to provide clean air. For the main city to have been able to survive, the ventilation system can receive at least a first-class merit award. He smiled. After the artificial magnetic poles were built, various mutations began. Before the disperser was invented, there were insects everywhere, so the main city added 3-layer filter and strangulation systems to the air inlets and outlets of the ventilation system to ensure that not even a single bug could fly in. In other words, no matter what, as long as we control the ins and outs of the city gate, the main city will be absolutely safe. You just jinxed yourself. As he typed out an email on his computer, he talked almost to himself. Why exactly would an infection incident happen? That doesn't make any sense. Moreover, the Garden of Eden's other children are all fine. At this point, his movement stopped, and then he looked at Lu Feng. I heard that a girl escaped from the Garden of Eden yesterday. I've asked, Lu Feng said. That girl is completely normal. The doctor frowned even more deeply, and he typed out some information on the keyboard. Lu Feng looked at the computer screen. Are you contacting the underground city base? Because of the series of events that have happened recently, I'm a little afraid. The doctor took a deep breath. I want to know to what extent the monsters in North America have evolved. However, the emergency channels between our base have always been subject to the vagaries of fate, and it's almost certain that we won't be able to get a result. With those words, he clicked send, and Anji saw him send an identical email to another recipient labeled Research Institute at the same time. All right, the doctor closed the interface. I'm going to go calibrate the instrument. I'll go to the Garden of Eden first, Lu Feng said. The lighthouse's corridor was long and white, by a cold light. There was a break room in the corridor, and when they pushed the door open and exited, 2 researchers in white coats were kissing in the break room. Yep, they were kissing in the break room. After hearing the sound of footsteps outside, one of the researchers grabbed the other and turned. Their figures disappeared in the depths of the break room. Okay, not gonna lie, that just seems random. Like, cool. Like, you're doing it on your break time, nice, but okay. The spectacle seemed to pique Lu Fang's distaste, for he frowned slightly. What happened to your disciple? It can't be helped, the doctor said. The more we research, the more we despair. Right now, the lighthouse is suffused from top to bottom with an air of carpe diem. Can't ask for the military's discipline from us. I myself also feel hopeless sometimes. Well, when you put it that way, fine. Lu Fang didn't say anything. At the corner, he took Anji in a different direction from the doctor. That afternoon, Anji blindly followed Lu Fang. The reason was because he didn't know where he ought to go. He could only be considered a temporary worker in the Garden of Eden, so he hadn't received any other orders or instructions. However, despite being followed, Lu Fang didn't seem to feel displeased. When this man examined the Garden of Eden's children one by one, he even had Anji go to the main hall to rest for a while. That was nice. Thus, Anji read a book while on the sofa in the main hall, and upon the wall in front of him was the blood-red "Humankind's interests take precedence over all others" slogan again. At 4 p.m., the doctor brought others to the Garden of Eden. He was a bit dispirited as he led several subordinates in starting up the detection instrument in the hall. Sarang had been sent by Lu Fang to cooperate with the doctor's work. The young judge saw the instrument in the center of the hall and frowned slightly. There's only one of them? What else? The doctor said. The other one was left at the entrance of the main city, receiving the returning mercenaries who were originally from the outer city. In other words, the entire base currently has only 2 instruments? Sarang asked. Darling, aren't you misunderstanding something about our current industrial production capacity? The doctor said. For high-precision large instruments such as these detectors, 2 units is already the limit. My apologies, Sarang said. That's fine, the doctor said. You all go over things once first, and we'll use the instruments to screen slowly. Sarang said earnestly. The trial court has not conducted special training focusing on the children. The doctor said, I believe in the arbitrator's eyesight. Definitely be able to ferret out other infected bodies. While they were talking, the sound of Lu Fang's footsteps came over. The investigation of the 5th, 6th, and 7th floors is complete, Lu Fang said into his communicator. No suspected infected ones have been found. Anji saw the doctor's hand tremble as he adjusted the instrument's control stick. Fang walked past him. This side will be left to you all. The doctor's face was a little pale for some reason as he said, all right. After that, he also said, the lighthouse has many xenogenic samples. Since infection has occurred in the Garden of Eden, I'm afraid that an accident happened in the lighthouse as well. Could you apply for a temporary stationing of the trial court with the United Front Center? Lu Feng asked, what's my level of authority? The doctor said, the same as mine. All right. He walked to the elevator entrance. Anji silently watched him go. And he saw the man turn back and look at him. In that gaze was written a command. Come here. Or, since it's written in italics, come here. Oh, that felt weird. Sorry. Continuing, Anji put the book down that was in his hands and obediently followed him. Right at that moment, Lu Fang, the doctor suddenly said. Fang didn't turn back. What is it? She turned slightly and saw the doctor looking in their direction. There was a lost look in his azure eyes, and their rims were slightly red. 100 years ago, after people were wounded, there was only a 30% infection rate, and slight scratches or pricks wouldn't result in mutations at all. But these past few years, the situation has been constantly deteriorating. Especially this year, the infection rate has skyrocketed. You know as well that even a wound the size of a needle's eye can result in infection. I've always been thinking whether or not there would be a day like this, when we would do nothing at all, and our genes will become disordered regardless, turning us all into xenogenics. Lu Feng neither moved nor spoke. The ding announcing the elevator's arrival, the silver doors smoothly opened. The doctor's voice was slightly tremulous. The Garden of Eden doesn't have monsters or xenogenics. This children's infection happened without any rhyme or reason. We still don't know what causes infection or how it spreads. The lighthouse cannot capture that virus and does not know how to defend against it. If these things have already crawled their way to our insides like an epidemic, the weakest children will be infected first because of their individual constitutions. He gasped for breath. Then what exactly are we to do? Dr. G. Lu Feng's voice was cold. You're wavering. With that, he rested his right hand on Anji's shoulder and steered him towards the elevator without even a backwards look. I'm glad you like that, Mo Mars Rover. After reaching the residential building and getting out of Lu Feng's car, Anji said, "Thank you." "No problem," Lu Feng said. "What are your meal plans?" "I'll cook," Anji said. "Potato soup?" "Mm-hmm." "You like it?" Anji earnestly pondered for a while. "I do," he said, "but I also don't have money to buy anything else." "I can see that," Lu Feng said. "Tonight, I'll treat you to something else." "How come?" Anji asked. Lu Feng said, "To thank you for helping me discover a xenogenic." These words sounded correct. It was only because of him that Lu Feng noticed Sinan. Thus, Anji received the opportunity to pick and choose from the ingredients area. Referencing the menu given by the base, in the end he bought tomatoes, potatoes, and frozen beef. The price of the beef was very high, and it was specially marked with a label next to it indicating that its production was about to stop. He was undecided for a while on whether to buy it or not, but while he was undecided, Lu Feng had already swiped his card. We love a rich sugar daddy. The balance displayed on the card machine made Anji feel the difference between people. Next to the ingredients were simple usage instructions. Anji didn't know anything else, so he still made soup. The soup cooked, Anji discovered something. He stood in place, silently watching the slightly turbulent surface of the water in the pot. Soup had become very thick, and the potatoes had completely softened as well. The soft sweet sour aroma of the tomatoes and fragrance of the beef mixed together, forming a smell different from that of potato soup. It was very delicious. However, Lu Feng looked at him. "What is it?" Anji lifted his head to look at Lu Feng. But Lu Feng returned the gaze with his green eyes, and through a layer of white steam, they didn't seem very fierce. Anji said, "I seem to have made too much." "Too much?" Lu Feng walked over to him, leaned over slightly, and looked into the pot. It truly was too much, Anji knew. He added too many ingredients and too much water. When he made potato soup, in order to make the potatoes a bit softer and the soup a bit thicker, he liked to add a lot of water and then slowly reduce the large quantity of water into a very small amount of soup. However, the principles of this soup seemed different from those of potato soup. If he continued to reduce it, the ingredients would fall apart and it would become a pot of mysterious things mixed together. He estimated that even if this soup was divided into portions of 3, it would be more than enough. Lu Feng said, "It is too much." Ji thought hard and finally arrived at a corrective measure. "Can you invite Colin up to eat?" Lu Feng turned and gave him a flat look. "Oh boy, you just asked to invite a third wheel to a dinner that your boo paid for? Oh man. Tisk." From the flat look, Anji assuredly picked up on a hint of Lu Feng's feelings. It seemed that making too much soup had become a severe mistake. Feng said, "Serang lives in number 3202. Go give him a portion." Actually, yeah, I like that option better too. He's nicer. After ringing number 3202's doorbell, Sarang opened the door very quickly from inside. It's you? He seemed slightly surprised. Anji handed the thermos to him. I made soup. Here's a portion for you. Wow, Sarang said. Thank you. Was just about to go out for dinner. Anji gave him the soup and said, You're welcome. Sarang spoke up again. Why did you give this to me? Perhaps the colonel will like it? Anji was momentarily unsure how to respond. In the end, he said, The colonel has some too. Sarang smiled. That's what I guessed. So it's the colonel who told you where I live here? Oh my gosh. Let me reread that whole thing. Anji was momentarily unsure how to respond. In the end, he said, The colonel has some too. Sarang smiled. That's what I guessed. So it was the colonel who told you that I live here? Anji nodded. Sarang brought Anji inside and after putting the thermos on the living room table, took out something wrapped in pink from a drawer. By the looks of it, it seemed to be a human snack. He stuffed it into Anji's hand, saying, I'll treat you to some candy. Anji said, Thank you. Sarang said, Have you gotten used to living in the main city? Which floor do you live on? Anji said, I'm in number 3702. My God, Sarang smiled. What a coincidence! Wild gales blew outside, and the wailing sound of the wind in the pipes was coming from Sarang's room as well. And she looked in the direction of the sound's origin. The ventilation pipes were originally closed, but in the summer when the wind is strong, they will be entirely open for a period of time to prevent the insides of the pipes from getting too damp. During this time, it'll always make noise. When the sound is too loud, sometimes even those who have lived in the main city since they were young will be unable to sleep because of it, but there's no need to be afraid. Sarang's tone was very gentle. Once he was done talking, he gave another smile. But the colonel has probably already reassured you. Anji felt confused. Firstly, he didn't feel afraid, so he didn't need to be reassured. And secondly, Lu Feng had never reassured him before at all. He said, He hasn't. Maybe he forgot. Anji felt that Sarang thought of Lu Feng as too kind of a person, and the relationship between the two of them was too good. He returned to number 3702, where the colonel had unexpectedly deigned to set the table himself. But unfortunately, even though a portion of it had been given away, there was still quite a lot of soup remaining. A certain colonel's ice-cold green eyes looked at him. You can do it. I can't. You can't waste the base's resources. Anji scooped up a small piece of beef with his spoon and strove to swallow it. After he had finished eating his own portion, he had been forced by Lu Feng to face the remainder in the pot, and now half of it was gone. Lu Feng's tone of voice was flat. Keep going. She ate another piece of potato and a spoonful of soup. He felt like he had reached his limit. Human appetites had limits. Even if this soup was very delicious, he'd break. He lifted his head and looked at Lu Feng, but he saw this man looking at him, eyebrows slightly lifted, and a hint of quiet joy in his expression. Anji was speechless. Should have already known. Lu Feng's objective wasn't to conserve the base's resources at all. The colonel's happiness was built upon bullying him. He frowned, slightly angry. This time, with a resolute attitude, he said, I'm not eating any more. Feng said, crime of wasting provisions. She retorted, then you've committed it too. Feng looked at him with crossed arms, and after seeming to examine him once from top to bottom, he said, You've gotten smart. Anji understood what he meant. He vowed that the next time this man came to eat, he would cut off a piece of his own hype and put it in to poison him. Planning to no longer acknowledge this man, he dropped his spoon. But on the contrary, Lu Feng smiled. He reached out and put the remaining soup in front of himself. It looked like the arbiter was going to exonerate himself. She observed his actions for a while, then decided to reduce it from 1 piece to half a piece. After dinner, he saw Lu Feng out. The colonel still had telephone teleconferences to attend at night. Dude never gets a break. The doorway, Lu Feng suddenly seemed to recall something. He took a small translucent box from the front pocket of his uniform and tossed it to Anji. If you can't sleep, you can use that, he said. After returning to his own room, Anji took apart the box. It was a pair of white umbrella-shaped rubber noise prevention earplugs. Contemplated over and over, still wavering between whether Lu Feng was really a good or bad person. And in the end, he temporarily defined the man as a changeable person. The wind outside continued picking up, and the sound inside the hole turned slightly shrill to a degree where it indeed made it difficult for humans to fall asleep. But he had no intention of putting in those earplugs, at least not for now. Anji stood in front of his bed. This entire afternoon had been... Oh my goodness. Anji stood in front of his bed. This entire afternoon, he had been thinking of one thing. If he couldn't move about freely within the lighthouse, then when exactly would he be able to find his spore? Once he felt that this was an insurmountable problem, but now he had a path he could walk. All of the city's buildings were linked together by the ventilation pipes. He turned his head and looked at the window. The window was very small, only about the size of 2 textbooks put together, and at its sides were 2 sliding metal shutters. He walked over to the window and forcibly pushed the sliding doors together. With a click, the shutters fit together perfectly. Like this, nobody could see into the room from the outside. Hype extended outward from Anji's body. His clothes and the bullet shell necklace around his neck fell to the ground together, making a soft noise. At the same time, a ball of snow-white hype made its way out from the shirt collar and rolled under the bed, quietly facing the pitch-black hole. When his body changed into a mushroom, Anji had a vague perception of the outside world. Senses of sight and hearing combined, while his senses of smell and touch could not be distinguished from each other. They were no longer sights or sounds, but rather a peculiar feeling. There was no way to describe this kind of change with human language. The hole had fine wire mesh, 3 layers of it, which was enough to block all insects, big or small. But it couldn't block a soft mushroom. And that is the end of chapter 18, where I'm going to finish for tonight. We got 2 extras. So we will start at chapter 19 next time. And if we're going kind of by 3 chapters, 3-ish, then it looks like we'll probably finish within the next 2 times. So I'm pretty happy with how it's going. I'm thinking, I know that I've been saying that I want to do Tuesday, Thursdays, but I'm thinking I will probably end up doing it Friday at 8 CST this week. I know a lot of us came from Kichter's channel, or at least I'm assuming, and she is actually doing it Thursday today. I would like to attend. So we're actually going to be doing it Friday, the next chapter. I will make a post about that just in case on my YouTube. But I think we had a great session tonight. I am excited to read what comes next. We're finally getting to the lighthouse, to him finding his spore, maybe. But probably not for a while. There's probably going to be some hijinks. So I hope all of you had a great time. I know I did. And I hopefully will see you Friday at 8. Good night. Perfect. I will see you there, Mo Mars Rover. Hopefully I'll see some other of you friends there too. All right. Good night.